They forced the Lakota woman to kneel. What the rancher did will shock you. They forced her to kneel in the open yard, where wagons passed and voices carried, not because it was required, but because humiliation worked best when it had witnesses. And the Lakota woman felt the dirt press into her knees as hands shoved her shoulders down until her posture broke. Her braids slipped forward, brushing the dust, and the man standing behind her barked an order she did not answer, because answering would have given him more than he deserved. A small crowd gathered quickly, some pretending not to stare, others watching openly with a dull interest reserved for someone else's suffering. And the sheriff stood nearby with his thumbs hooked in his belt, observing rather than intervening, telling himself this was not his fight. They accused her of theft, without proof anyone could name, pointing to a missing pouch and letting suspicion do the work of evidence, because it was easier than admitting they had already decided. When she refused to speak their words back to them, they pushed her lower, demanding submission instead of truth. And the sound of her breath tightening drew a few uneasy looks that were quickly replaced by silence. The rancher arrived as the circle tightened, horse blowing hard, boots striking dirt with purpose. And he took in the scene without asking questions aloud, because the answers were already visible in posture and tone. He saw the way her back stayed straight even as she knelt, the way the men leaned forward as if courage came from proximity, and the way the crowd waited for something ugly to justify their watching. He did not shout. He did not rush. He stepped between the woman and the men holding her, not touching anyone yet, only occupying space that had not been offered. And the sudden shift unsettled them more than force would have. Someone told him to move, reminding him whose land this was, whose rules applied, and the rancher answered calmly that no rule he recognized required a woman to kneel in the dirt without proof. The sheriff straightened then, attention sharpened by the tone rather than the words, and the crowd leaned closer, sensing the edge where violence usually began. The rancher bent slightly and spoke to the woman for the first time, telling her she could stand, his voice steady enough to make the order sound like permission rather than defiance. She hesitated, knowing how quickly permission could turn into punishment. And the rancher held his position, eyes level with those who would stop her, making it clear that whatever happened next would not belong to her alone. As she rose slowly to her feet, dust falling from her skirts, the crowd felt something crack, not in authority, but in certainty. And they realized too late that what shocked them was not what the rancher was about to do, but what he had already refused to allow. The yard held its breath as she finished standing, the movement slow and deliberate, because no one wanted to be the first to decide whether the moment had passed or only begun. And the rancher understood that hesitation was the most dangerous space of all. He stayed where he was, slightly angled between the Lakota woman and the men who had forced her down, not touching her and not signaling ownership, only making it clear that access to her now required him to be addressed first. One of the men scoffed and said the rancher was overstepping, that discipline was necessary when someone refused to cooperate. And the rancher replied that discipline without proof was just humiliation wearing a badge. The words were calm, almost conversational, and that calm irritated them more than shouting would have, because it suggested confidence rather than defiance. The sheriff stepped closer then, eyes moving from face to face, and asked what evidence they had, the question landing awkwardly because it should have been asked earlier. They offered fragments in response, guesses stitched together by assumption, and the crowd shifted uneasily as each piece fell short of certainty. The Lakota woman remained silent, hands folded, eyes forward, because she had learned how easily words could be twisted once they were offered. And the rancher respected that silence, refusing to speak for her or demand that she defend herself. He told the men that if there was a claim, it could be taken to the sheriff properly, and if there was proof, it could be examined without spectacle. But that kneeling in the dirt was not justice, and never had been. A few people in the crowd nodded without realizing it, recognition arriving before courage, and one woman near the wagons turned away, uncomfortable with having watched as long as she had. The sheriff cleared his throat and said the rancher was right, that if there was no clear accusation, the matter should be handled formally or not at all, and the admission changed the balance, because authority had finally aligned with restraint. One of the men protested that letting her go would make them look weak, and the rancher answered that weakness came from needing someone smaller to feel strong, and the line landed hard because it named what everyone could see. The men stepped back reluctantly, muttering about unfinished business, and the crowd loosened, not dispersing yet, but no longer pressing inward. The rancher turned slightly toward the woman and asked if she wished to leave, his tone offering choice rather than command. And she nodded once, the movement small but resolute. As they began to walk, space opened without being asked for, and the people who moved aside felt the weight of their earlier stillness settle into something like responsibility. No blow had been struck and no threat made. Yet the yard felt altered, because permission had been removed from cruelty. And once permission was gone, the crowd no longer knew where to stand. They had taken only a few steps when the first voice rose behind them, not angry, but uncertain, asking whether the accusation would simply disappear now. And the question spread through the yard because it gave shape to the discomfort people were trying not to feel. The rancher stopped without turning around, aware that leaving too quickly would let the moment collapse into rumor. And he said that accusations did not disappear when handled properly. They either proved themselves or failed. And both outcomes required daylight rather than spectacle. The sheriff nodded once, firmer this time, and announced that if anyone wished to make a formal claim, they could do so at the office with names and evidence attached, the way the law required when it was not being used for show. No one stepped forward. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouts had been, because it forced the crowd to recognize how thin their certainty had been and how easily it had turned into permission to degrade someone else. The Lakota woman stood beside the rancher, posture straight now, eyes lifted, not challenging anyone but refusing to retreat back into herself. And the shift unsettled those who had expected gratitude or fear in return. A man near the edge muttered that things had gone too far, that respect would be lost if order was questioned like this. And the rancher answered without heat that respect was not taken by force. It was maintained by fairness, and the crowd felt the difference between authority explained and authority exposed. The sheriff added that no one would be detained without cause, and the words carried weight now because they had been delayed long enough to matter. People began to step back, some embarrassed, others defensive, each retreat in admission that watching had been a choice, not an accident. A woman who had looked away earlier met the Lakota woman's eyes briefly, then nodded, the gesture small but deliberate, and the woman returned it, understanding that acknowledgement did not erase what had happened, but did mark its end. Wagons resumed moving, conversations restarted in lowered tones, and the yard found a new rhythm that felt cautious rather than cruel. The rancher asked quietly whether she wished to go to his place until things settled, not offering protection as ownership but as shelter freely given. And she accepted after a pause, knowing that refusing would cost her more energy than she had left. As they walked away together, no one followed and no one shouted after them, and the crowd felt something shift into place. Not resolution, not harmony, but accountability. They had lost their excuse, the comfort of claiming they were only watching. And once that excuse was gone, the memory of the woman kneeling in the dirt could no longer be dismissed as necessary. It stayed with them as the day went on, asking questions they would have to answer the next time humiliation tried to pass itself off as order. They left the yard at a pace that invited no pursuit, the rancher keeping just enough distance to make it clear he was not escorting a prisoner, but accompanying a woman who had chosen to move. And the Lakota woman felt the ground change beneath her boots as they crossed from packed dirt into the open road where sound thinned, and the crowd's attention could no longer cling. She did not look back, not out of pride, but because turning would have pulled the moment with her, and she needed it to stay behind where it belonged. The rancher asked nothing at first, understanding that words spoken too early could feel like demands, and the quiet between them settled into something steadier than reassurance. From the corner of her eye, she noticed how people along the road paused in their work and then resumed, glances brief and measured, as if deciding whether acknowledgement was safer than curiosity. The sheriff followed at a distance for a few steps, then stopped, choosing visibility over intervention, and the decision mattered because it signaled that restraint had finally become policy rather than accident. When they reached the fork where the road bent toward the ranch, the woman slowed, testing whether the invitation still stood without the pressure of witnesses. And the rancher waited without urging, his posture making space for refusal. She continued, and the choice felt like a weight lifting, not because danger was gone, but because it had been named and answered without spectacle. As they walked, she spoke at last, saying only that kneeling had not been the worst part, that being made small in front of people who pretended it was necessary had cut deeper. And the rancher listened without interrupting, because fixing humiliation required more attention than advice. He told her the ranch was quiet, and that she could stay as long as she wished, no debt implied. And the clarity of the offer steadied her more than promises ever had. Behind them, the yard resumed its noise in pieces, too loud at first, then correcting itself, because crowds often needed sound to cover the work of thinking. By the time the ranch came into view, fences straight against the horizon, the woman felt the residue of eyes lift from her back, replaced by the practical concerns of distance and dusk. She noticed then how walking without being chased felt different from walking free. And the difference mattered because it meant the moment had ended on her terms. When they reached the gate, the rancher opened it and stepped aside, letting her enter first, and the gesture, simple and unannounced, carried a final correction to what had been done in the yard. She crossed the threshold without hurry, understanding that dignity did not return all at once, but arrived step by step, in places where permission was no longer required. The ranch house sat low against the land, weathered boards holding the warmth of a day spent under open sky. And the Lakota woman felt the quiet meet her before the doorway did. A quiet that did not press or evaluate, but simply existed. The rancher led the way inside and set his hat down without ceremony, pointing out water, a chair, a place to rest, each offered plainly as options rather than expectations. And the absence of instruction steadied her more than any welcome speech could have. She noticed how the space carried signs of use without display. Boots by the door, a table scarred by work, a stove that smelled faintly of coffee. And the ordinariness of it all felt corrective after the spectacle of the yard. The rancher asked whether she was hungry and accepted her nod without comment, setting about preparing a simple meal with movements practiced and unhurried, because providing without interrogation was its own kind of respect. As he worked, she watched the window, half expecting the road to deliver voices or authority. And when none came, she realized how much of her body had been braced for interruption. He set a plate before her and stepped back, taking his own seat only after she had begun and the space he kept signaled that shelter did not require ownership. She ate slowly, aware of how hunger returned once fear loosened its grip. And when she spoke again, it was to say her name and little else, because naming herself felt like reclaiming something that had been threatened. The rancher answered with his own name and nothing more, refusing to fill the room with stories that might weigh her down, and the balance of it allowed the moment to settle. Outside, the light shifted toward evening, shadows lengthening along the fence, and the woman felt the day's weight arrive in pieces. Hands still remembering the pressure that had forced her down, ears still carrying the sound of watching. But the house did not echo it back to her. After the meal, the rancher showed her a small room with a bed and clean linens, saying she could leave at first light if she wished or stay until she didn't, the choice remaining hers without qualification. She tested the mattress with one hand, surprised by how unfamiliar rest felt when it was not earned through exhaustion. And the rancher paused at the doorway, making it clear the threshold was hers to cross or not. When she finally sat, the day's tension slipped from her shoulders in a way that felt almost dangerous. And she breathed carefully, as if sudden relief might invite its own cost. From the porch, the rancher watched the land darken and listened for sounds that did not come, understanding that protection was not measured by proximity alone, but by the discipline of not turning shelter into debt. As night settled, the house held steady, and the woman realized that dignity, once interrupted, could be rebuilt not with declarations, but with rooms that asked nothing and stayed quiet long enough for a person to remember how to stand. Morning arrived without announcement, light slipping through the window in narrow bands that warmed the floor before touching the bed. And the Lakota woman woke with the unfamiliar sensation of having slept without listening for footsteps or voices outside the door. She sat up slowly, testing the quiet as if it might withdraw if she moved too quickly. And when it held, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since the yard. The rancher was already awake, moving about the kitchen with the soft efficiency of someone who respected mornings. And when she stepped into the room, he greeted her with a nod that acknowledged her presence without demanding explanation. Coffee steamed on the stove, and he poured her a cup without asking, setting it where she could reach it, then returned to his work as if trust did not need to be announced. She wrapped her hands around the warmth and felt something loosen in her chest, because being offered care without scrutiny made room for words that had been crowded out by fear. After a moment, she told him why she had been in the yard, how a missing pouch had been blamed on her because it was easy, how speaking had only tightened suspicion, and how kneeling had been meant to teach her where she belonged. She did not raise her voice or seek sympathy. She spoke as someone placing facts on a table and stepping back to let them stand. The rancher listened without interruption, eyes steady. And when she finished, he said only that humiliation was often used when truth was inconvenient, and that he had seen it work too many times to mistake it for order. The simplicity of the response steadied her, because it named what had happened without turning it into spectacle. Outside, the ranch stirred awake, cattle shifting, wind moving through grass, and the ordinary sounds grounded the conversation in a world that continued regardless of what the town believed. She asked what would happen next, and the rancher answered honestly that the town might test its habits again, that resentment sometimes waited for quiet moments, but that she would not face it alone unless she chose to. He offered to ride with her later, to collect what she needed or to speak to the sheriff if it became necessary, not as a threat, but as presence, and the distinction mattered. She considered the offer carefully, weighing the cost of being seen against the cost of hiding, and she said she would decide after the sun climbed higher, because daylight had a way of clarifying choices. They finished their coffee in silence that felt companionable rather than strained. And when she stood to rinse her cup, he did not stop her, understanding that dignity returned through action as much as rest. As the morning settled into the ranch, she felt words begin to arrange themselves differently inside her, no longer crowded by the need to defend. And she understood that the shock people spoke of had not been the rancher's intervention alone, but the space that followed it, where a woman who had been forced to kneel could finally speak without being pushed down again. By the time the sun stood high, the yard where she had been forced to kneel felt strangely exposed, as if the space itself remembered what had happened and refused to settle back into habit. People passed through with smaller groups and shorter conversations, eyes lifting toward the open ground and then away, because absence sometimes spoke louder than presence. And the Lakota woman's absence had removed the excuse that had allowed watching to feel harmless. The sheriff heard fragments as he made his rounds. Questions about the missing pouch, doubts about who had first raised the accusation, remarks about how quickly humiliation had been chosen over inquiry. And he understood that what the rancher had done could not be undone by returning to routine. A merchant admitted he had seen the pouch earlier near the wagons, and said nothing because it seemed easier to let suspicion land where it always did. And the admission spread discomfort because it named a choice many had made without ever acknowledging it. Near the saloon, a man tried to laugh the moment away, calling it an overreaction stirred by outside interference, and the laughter failed to gather, falling flat against faces that no longer wanted it. And the failure mattered because it showed the crowd had lost its cover. At the ranch, the woman watched the land settle into afternoon, aware that the town's noise no longer pressed against her ears, and she weighed the cost of returning against the cost of letting the story harden without her voice in it. The rancher saddled his horse and said he would ride into town later, not to confront anyone, but to listen for what had shifted. And she nodded, understanding that change measured itself in tone as much as action. When he returned near dusk, he brought news without drama. The sheriff had asked for the matter to be brought properly. The accusers had faltered when pressed for details, and the missing pouch had been found where it could not accuse anyone at all. The woman felt a sharp mix of relief and anger rise and settle, because proof arriving late did not erase what had already been done, and the rancher did not soften that truth for her. He told her the town was quieter, not healed, and that quiet would test people in ways shouting never did. She decided then that she would return once, not to seek apology or spectacle, but to collect what was hers and to be seen standing, because disappearance would let others decide what her kneeling had meant. As evening cooled the land, the rancher opened the gate again and waited without urging, and she stepped through with a steadier stride than before, knowing that the shock people would talk about was not the interruption in the yard, but the refusal to stay gone. The choice to exist in daylight after humiliation had tried to make her smaller, and that choice would ask more of the town than any confrontation ever could. The town noticed her before she reached the center, not because anyone announced her arrival, but because posture carried faster than rumor, and the Lakota woman walked with her head level, steps measured, refusing both haste and hesitation. The rancher rode a few paces behind, not close enough to claim her path and not far enough to pretend neutrality, and the distance itself communicated choice rather than protection. Conversations thinned as she passed, not stopping entirely but adjusting. People unsure whether to look directly or grant privacy that had not been offered before. At the yard, the place where the dirt had pressed into her knees, she paused and took in the space without flinching, noticing how ordinary it appeared now that spectacle had been stripped away. The sheriff approached first, removing his hat and speaking quietly, saying the accusation had collapsed under scrutiny and that no charges would be pursued. And though the words were expected, hearing them aloud mattered because it placed responsibility back where it belonged. She thanked him without softness and without edge, acknowledging the correction without absolution, and the exchange set the tone for what followed. A few townsfolk hovered at the edge, testing whether apology would be welcomed or rejected, and she met their uncertainty with presence rather than performance, making it clear she would not rehearse pain for their comfort. One woman stepped forward and returned a small bundle that had been taken during the confusion, murmuring an explanation that did not quite reach excuse. And the Lakota woman accepted it with a nod that closed the moment without reopening the wound. The rancher stayed silent, understanding that intervention now would flatten what needed to stand on its own. And his restraint carried its own weight because it showed that support did not require a voice. Someone asked whether she would stay, whether she would trade again as before. And the question rippled because it asked the town to imagine her as a constant rather than an incident. She answered that she would do as she always had, which was to come and go on her own terms, and the simplicity of it unsettled those who hoped for closure. The yard resumed its motion in pieces, wagons creaking, goods changing hands, and the Lakota woman moved through it without hurry, choosing her path rather than being guided. And the people who made space for her did so deliberately, aware that courtesy was now visible. When she finished what she had come to do, she turned toward the road without ceremony, and no one stopped her, because stopping would have felt like another demand. As she walked away, the town felt the difference between forgiveness asked for and dignity returned, understanding that what had shocked them was not the rancher's refusal to allow kneeling, but her decision to return standing, forcing everyone to reckon with what they had seen and what they would choose the next time power tempted them to look away. After she left the yard, the town did not rush to explain itself, and that restraint mattered more than any apology would have, because people were learning how heavy memory could be when it was no longer buried under noise. The place where she had knelt remained visible in everyone's mind, even as wagons rolled over it and boots pressed the dirt flat again. And the ease with which it could be covered only sharpened the awareness of how easily it had been created. Men who had stood closest that day avoided one another's eyes now, uncertain how much responsibility each carried alone and how much belonged to the circle they had formed together. And the uncertainty followed them into their work, like a question they could not finish asking. The sheriff noticed it most when disputes arose, small ones that once would have been handled with raised voices and quick assumptions. And he found himself slowing the process deliberately, asking questions before deciding, because he had seen what speed could do when paired with certainty. A merchant corrected a customer who tried to joke about the incident, not sharply but firmly, and the correction passed without argument, because laughter had lost its cover. Children repeated the story in fragments, not focusing on the kneeling but on the moment she stood. And parents listened more carefully than they had before, aware that what was learned young often decided what would be tolerated later. Not everyone softened. A few hardened instead, insisting that the town had been made to look weak, that order depended on visible submission. And they spoke among themselves in tones meant to rebuild confidence. But even there something faltered, because they had seen how easily authority had leaned on humiliation, and the knowledge refused to stay quiet. The rancher felt the shift when he returned home, not through praise or thanks, but through the absence of hostility, the way people looked at him differently without naming why. And he understood that intervention carried its own burden long after the moment passed. He did not seek her out again, respecting that dignity returned did not require supervision, and the distance allowed her choice to stand on its own. Days later, when another accusation threatened to rise on nothing but assumption. Someone spoke sooner. Another hesitated, and the chain broke before it could tighten, and no one mentioned her name, because they did not need to. The lesson had outgrown its origin. What the crowd could not unsee was not the rancher stepping forward, but the way humiliation had required their agreement to exist, and how easily that agreement had been given. Once that truth settled, it followed them everywhere, asking quietly whether they would lend it again, and the question proved harder to ignore than any shout ever had. What shocked the town in the end was not the rancher's step into the yard, or even the way authority had paused when challenged, but how little force it had taken to change the direction of something that had felt inevitable. Days passed, then weeks, and the Lakota woman did not become a story people told for comfort or warning. She became a reference point, the quiet moment everyone remembered when speed felt tempting and certainty felt easy. The yard returned to its routines, but the way people gathered in circles had changed. Looser now, less eager to close ranks around a single body, because everyone had felt how quickly a crowd could become a weapon without ever lifting a hand. The sheriff found that his badge carried a different weight, not heavier, but sharper, because people watched not only what he enforced, but what he allowed to form in silence, and that awareness followed him through every decision. The rancher returned to his work without expecting thanks or credit, understanding that intervention done for recognition rarely lasted, and the absence of celebration protected the change from becoming a performance. He heard her name only once more, spoken quietly by someone who mentioned seeing her on the road beyond the river, walking alone with her back straight, and the image stayed with him because it confirmed what mattered. That dignity did not require supervision to survive. In town, a man stopped himself before repeating an old insult. Another redirected a conversation before it turned sharp. And these small acts passed unnoticed, except by those who remembered how close things had come to going wrong. Not everyone approved of the restraint that had settled in. Some resented it, feeling exposed without the comfort of shared cruelty, and they tested the edges now and then. But each test was met with hesitation rather than encouragement, and the hesitation proved stronger than argument. Children absorbed the lesson without being taught, learning which jokes earned silence and which earned correction, and parents realized too late how powerful example could be when it arrived unannounced. The town did not become just overnight, and no one pretended it had. But it learned something harder and more useful, that humiliation required cooperation, and cooperation could be withdrawn. When the yard filled again on market days, voices rose and fell, business was done and life continued. Yet beneath it all ran a thin, steady awareness that power did not belong solely to those who gave orders, but to those who decided whether to agree. That was the shock no one had expected to carry forward. Not the rancher's refusal to let a woman kneel, but the realization that stopping cruelty had taken only one person willing to stand still and say no, and a crowd forced at last to decide what it would do with that example once it could no longer unsee it. If you had been standing in that yard, would you have stayed silent? Or stepped forward like he did? Like the video, share this story with someone who believes dignity should never be forced to kneel, and subscribe for more Western American tales.